All right, what's up, guys? This is The Quest, my podcast on iTunes and on YouTube. Obviously, you're watching on YouTube. Today, my guest is my partner and friend, Robin Chan. He's a partner at Goat Capital, the venture firm we started together. He was an early investor in Xiaomi, Uber, Square, Twitter, a lot of great companies. In this conversation, Robin and I talk about how we first met back when I was at Justin TV. We talk about investing. We talk about him meeting Jack Dorsey for the first time, becoming an early investor in Twitter, and much, much, much more. If you like this episode, make sure to smash like and subscribe and comment your favorite moment below. And here's the episode. What's up, brother?
What's up, man?
All right, let's kick it off. I'm excited for this one. People have been waiting for it. Everyone's always asking me, what do you do now? What's your job? I'm like, I'm a podcast host and content creator. But they want to know about the day job. And so who better to join me than my business partner at Goat Capital, one of my best friends, and one of the people I admire most, Robin Chan.
Ditto, man.
All right. I do want to give people in the Justin Con, the Quest ecosystem, the chance to get to know your story from the beginning, because we haven't really sat down and done that before. So let's start with the very beginning. Tell us, how did you get into technology?
Well, I grew up in Hawaii, and, being an island boy, I just felt like, I think when you grow up in Hawaii, you either kind of come away with two dreams for growing up. You either go stay in Hawaii and, go surfing and go start a family there, or you have bigger dreams. And when I was coming out of high school, I just discovered my first computer, and I was like, this is super cool. And I just thought that was where young people could work really hard and get lucky and get rewarded for just being, resourceful. So I just thought that was where I wanted to be. So I knew pretty early on that tech was going to be kind of pretty big, that the future was there. So I spent my time there.
So tech was interesting, computers were interesting, and you ended up going to college on the mainland, escaping the Hawaiian small town provincial thing.
So I applied to schools in West Coast, East Coast, and I want to do the opposite of what I grew up with. So the farthest I could imagine was going to New York.
The opposite side of America.
Yeah. And so I basically, wore flip-flops and shorts and didn't have dress shoes and any warm clothes. And I just go to New York and thought that I'd figure it out. And, of course, experienced my first winter that freshman year. And I think I didn't even know that you could buy thicker jackets. So I just put more T-shirts on. So I got pneumonia pretty quickly. But that was kind of my idea, was I wanted to challenge myself and go to put myself in an uncomfortable situation. So I went to the East Coast. A lot of my classmates went to the West Coast, like California, but I just thought that was a bigger challenge.
Where did that mindset come from, where you were I want to try uncomfortable things? That's something that really resonates with me. You watch me do a lot of uncomfortable things to myself. How did you get that mindset?
I think I always had a sense that if you put yourself in scary positions, you're going to learn something. And everything that we're kind of pushing ourselves to do in terms of scary things are all relatively scary things. These are not life-threatening things. These are personal growth scary things. And in that context, you realize that you should try that, right? I don't think it's terribly smart to ride a motorcycle. I've never been very inspired to put myself in that position. But if you want to go to a new city, if you want to change your career, I moved, we can talk about this later, but I was born in Hawaii, not fluent in Chinese. I moved to China on a one-way ticket and started a company, which is totally insane, right? So all of those are relatively crazy personal challenges that I just thought, if on the 1% chance this could work, this could change my life. So I should try. And so that's kind of been generally my way of thinking about sensing personal growth, is that, if something could make me really materially more interesting for myself, not from a point of insecurity, but a point of growth, I want to try it. Like, for example, growing up, I studied Japanese, thinking that, I'd do stuff in Japan. But, now the world's so different. I'm super interested in learning Arabic because it would open up a whole new world. I've visited a few times. Some of our investors in our fund are from the Middle East. I just felt a real comfort working with them and thought that, if I could learn that, a whole new world would open up on understanding them a little bit better. And I think a billion people speak the language, and so it's something that I would foster new relationships.
There's so much I want to talk about, dive into there. So one of the things I really admire about you is that you're so good at connecting with other people. You're very interested in other people and very caring for the people around you, and like that's something that I think people don't realize is such a powerful superpower to have. People talk a lot about like, oh, I need to like do good at school and study, and be good at like math or programming, like learning STEM stuff and, things like that, or maybe artistic pursuits or design pursuits or athletic ones. But, I think you're one of the rare people who, Robin is somebody who can get in touch with anyone in the world, right? And become friends with like anyone in the world. I could say like, oh, let's go figure out how to meet President Obama, and you could like go do it, and that's always really impressed me. So how did you develop that skill, and like where does that come from? And like might you recommend young people like think about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think it's something that I've kind of like been hyper conscious of, because I think that, if you overthink it, then it just feels inauthentic. I think that the idea of having connections with somebody, it just has to be at a one-on-one level, and you just really kind of have to get a feel for it. It's not like I can connect with everybody, but certainly I try to understand what the other person's about and see if we can find some common ground. One of the advice that I give young people, and I realized this really early in my career, is that we get so brainwashed in our careers thinking about how to get skills. So like, I have this fun exercise when you go in someone's LinkedIn, and then they write all these ridiculous things about why they're like out of box thinker, or like they just put all these adjectives in their career descriptions.
Yeah, it's like they're a strategist.
Oh my God, strategist, yeah. Or like brilliant, or just whatever, like really not humble words. And at the end of the day, what you're trying to do in a career is you try to be valuable and not expensive. And that's something that I kind of tell people when they're young in their careers. Like when I was trying to develop a relationship, or just kind of like think about how to like connect with people, the first basic thing is just to be useful. And how do you be useful? You could, in a very, personal context of we all have unique things that we can bring to the table. So what Justin's useful for or valuable for is different from what I'm valuable for. But we all can bring something like that to the table. And if you think about, how to connect to people that way, it comes across extremely authentic, right? Because like, if you're going there and it's just like, hey, let's trade. Like I bring this, you bring this. And the conversation starts to feel a little bit transactional, then it's not super interesting. And, that relationship will stink. But, you come in a context that you have something to give them with no expectations of reciprocity, but just like that you have something to give. And that's a good place to be. And everybody does have something to give. It's just you're in different stages of career, you're going to have different things. Does that make sense?
I love that. I think that's so true. And one thing I've learned from you is like, well, I think I learned it from my mom also. It's just like, how do you, create an environment where you're giving to the people around you and there's no expectation. And then, it all comes back to you eventually. Like if you put good energy and can put service out into the world, you'll reap the reward in return eventually.
Yeah. I mean, I give you an example. Like, early in my career, I had, very little money, very few relationships. But what relationships I did have, I would figure out how to connect dots to people that had never met to each other before. And by doing that, with no expectations except thinking that that'd be valuable to those two people, I became useful, right? Everybody can bridge that kind of those connections in the context of their networks. Even last year, I was with Justin when California shut down, and I just felt like we were all so lucky to just like shelter in place, and it was just like the whole world was kind of on fire, and Justin was witness to it. I was like, I could have been that. I'm fortunate that, because of my career in China, I had access to PPE, medical supplies, and I started a nonprofit out of Justin's house. And, we were able to help a lot of people. And one of the things that was fun about that was, you got to see a tremendous amount of patriotism from people who came all over to say, hey, I want to help too. And then you started to build all these incredible connections with people. And that just came from a sincere desire to just be helpful. And so, part of it, Justin, on that original question is like, how do you put that context in there, right? So how do you be useful, and then everything else kind of waterfalls from that.
I love that. So, okay, back to your origin story. It's like, how did you came to college in New York, and like, how did you parlay that into working in technology, and like, what are the ways maybe that you became, kind of use that philosophy to get your first job in technology?
Yeah, I started off just, taking programming classes. I realized really quickly that I wasn't very good at it. I think I took 2 to 3 programming classes, like Java and C++, and like, I just couldn't sit still. Like, I just hated waiting for compiling or waiting for all the debugging. I just couldn't stand it. So I realized early on that like, that was going to be the swim lane for me to have a technology career. I did end up hustling to learn HTML at the time in college because it paid a lot better than work study. So I started designing websites, and that was a really good job. And from that, I started doing internships. And one of the key things that I did with different internships in college was that I didn't really care about how much I got paid. It just goes to the previous comment about, valuable versus expensive. I just really cared about like having really quality career experiences. And so, my first internship was building websites at an agency, a couple of brands out there. And then second internship, my sophomore year, so my junior year, was this website called thestreet.com. Jim Cramer started this one. It's how I met Fred Wilson, who's now a good friend, but I started to slowly snowball this kind of interesting resume of experiences. So by the time I came out of school, I had like such a different lens on things. Oftentimes kids coming out of college, they just like do normal internships, and then they just hope they get a banking consulting job. And that's fine, right? But then like, you're basically starting from zero with a cohort of everybody from other top schools that are trying to get the same job. And in this case, I was like, okay, this is really where I want to go. And so where could I go? And by the time I went to, when I was coming out of school, when I was graduating, I was trying to figure out where I wanted to do my career. I knew pretty early on I didn't want to have a banking or consulting career. And so what I did from those experiences, I cold called the guys at Time Warner. And at this time, this was 1999. I don't know if like the audience recognizes like the first .com boom, but like it was peaking then. I had friends who were in college who like bought Yahoo stock off their credit cards and like paid off their tuition. It was like meme stocks 20 years ago. It was crazy. And and I was like, okay, I'm not going to do that. But like, I really want to like be part of the center of the internet. But I also didn't want to like live in Silicon Valley at the time, because at the time Silicon Valley was like, I don't know, strip malls in Palo Alto.
Yeah, like Sunnyvale is like strip mall sushi in Sunnyvale. I like
big cities, and like, so I was like, how do I have a technology career in New York? And I was like, it's New York, the tech scene was really small at the time. So I was like, let me go just get more experience. And so what I did was that I cold called Time Warner. It's like, hey, I would love to have an opportunity to work with you. The CFO of thestreet.com, this guy named Simon Clark, has really kind of taught me something really powerful. He's now like a really big guy. He's like, came from Fidelity, big guy. And I was a senior in college, and he got me connected to the CEO of Reuters, the CEO of Time Warner, the CEO of pretty much every major company. And I was like, I go to my dorm and I went to Columbia in New York, and I went to my dorm and like my voicemail was filled with the CEOs of these companies saying, "Hey, I'd love to meet you. Simon says I should talk to you." And obviously I have nothing to offer, right? I'm just this like poor student. But it blew my mind, and it actually put something in my head to remember to like do that when I'm in that position. And sure enough, like because of proximity of being in New York, I was able to take the subway and meet anybody within 30 minutes because a lot of these people were based in New York. I went through a bunch of interviews in Time Warner, and then they gave me the job. My basic pitch was like, hey, only a 21-year-old would say this. This is so obnoxious. I was like, hey, I know the internet and I'm really cheap. You should just hire me. And I had offers at Goldman and consulting banking, but my calling, I just thought that at the time, culture for the world was media. It was magazines, film, and to be part of kind of like what was happening with the internet and merging with media, that was where I wanted to be. So they gave me a job. And I was part of the Time Warner side when the AOL Time Warner merger happened, which is completely mind blowing. I mean, I don't know if I can say too much about kind of the chatter that was happening on the other side, but like, it was interesting to see as your first job, and a very well respected, established company feeling extremely disrupted and anxious about that. So that was cool.
And so then a couple of years later, you end up at Verizon, right? And that's how we met.
Yeah, a couple of years later, I had started a few companies in mobile. I was like, in 2000, I was like, oh, I totally missed the first wave. I was too old. I just missed it because it crashed in 2000. And I was like, okay, what's the next wave after the kind of the PC browser? I was looking at my black and white Nokia phone. I was like, this is going to be the next wave. This is going to be the internet. It's going to come to the cell phone. And I started companies on top of feature phones. And then when the next year had like color screens, I'm like, oh, there's going to be games. So let's go make a games company. And I built the company, the games business, to tens of millions of revenue, and big enough that Verizon was our largest customer. And at that point, Verizon said like, hey, would you be interested in like running or part of our data business? And, at this point I was kind of very entrepreneurial and had just loved the kind of the energy of being in startups and building things. And part of that, I started to meet these next generation entrepreneurs, including Justin. And at this time, this was like 3G. And I literally met you. I met Sam Altman. Sam Altman had his first startup called Looped. I go to Sam and it's like, hey, who's the craziest guy you know? And Sam's like, Justin. So I meet Justin at his office. I had, there's this little company called YouTube at the time. And I was like, oh, this is so much more interesting than all these like big media companies that are trying to get onto the cell phone. So I go to the contact us section of youtube.com and say, hey, I'm Robin. I'd love to meet you. Chad Hurley calls me from, I don't know, the 101. And he's like, hey, I'd love to meet you. And I was like, yo, your stuff is more interesting than all these other companies that are trying to pay us to like put their stuff on cell phones. Can we do a partnership? So we were the first to put YouTube on cell phones, and this is pre-iPhone. And what was crazy about that was the bandwidth was so expensive. I couldn't give Justin bandwidth for Justin TV.
And I begged you for it. I was like, please give us some data. And you
and like in the case of YouTube, like we cut in the contracts, like for the time being, you guys can only upload 10 clips a day, which is like obviously not very internet friendly, but that was just kind of the state of the technology at the time. But that was kind of that was pretty cool. And then got to meet Evan Williams, and then Evan introduced me to Jack Dorsey, and later on was able to invest in Jack because of all of this. You just I got to see with an instinct, like people were doing really interesting things with this new distribution.
So this plays out in our investing partnership, right? But you're always thinking about where the world's going. Like I'm a little bit more reactive in investing. I'm kind of like more micro, and you're more macro, right?
Yeah.
Like I often am like, oh, is the founder like really dedicated? Are they dynamic? Are they hardworking? Are they going to run through walls? And then like, is this idea seeming like it's good enough? And then if it is, if those things combine, then I'm like, okay, fund it and we'll see what happens. Because at the seed stage, it's like, I'm looking, it's maybe our backgrounds. Cause I'm looking for like the Justin Cons, right? The like, yeah, it's a stupid idea, but it's like, he's got some good partners and they're going to like hustle and figure it out. And maybe it'll be Twitch one day. And you've brought a lot of, refined my thinking a lot, because you've brought this thinking of like, where's the world going, and like, what are the themes of the world, and how do we like find the best entrepreneurs in those specific themes, right? So like in the 2000s for you, that was mobile. And then, after you were kind of doing this data business, you started this other company, right? That XPD Media, that was like kind of in China. We'll talk about that, and sold it to Zynga. So like, how did you get to be that way, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I definitely more macro. And the way I think about it is like, I've just posited a set of questions in my head of what are the big ideas. And then underneath those ideas, what are the opportunities and who's doing it? So in the case of, at that time, if there was going to be a mobile phone, it's a computer in your pocket, what could you do with it? And when there was an accelerometer, what could you do with that? When you had color screens, what could you do with that? And based on those questions, you start identifying kind of a product that will emerge, or a company that would emerge, and you try to find the best people that are trying to do that. I think that ends up making me probably being an investor is a kind of a good job for me, because like it allows me to not think about the day-to-day grind about when that opportunity will hit in a time scale. Where Justin is really good as an entrepreneur is like, you're much more like, how do we survive, and how do we just push through the first brutal couple of years? And so that's why I think we're a good team. The macro question helps me think about like really big ideas, and there aren't that many big ideas, right? And when you think about these tectonic shifts, then you go, okay, I just want to do the ballers things, right? I just want to do the biggest ideas, and then underneath it, there's going to be a company. And if you get involved in that company, that's all you want to do. You want to curate like you in your life in terms of like how you want to spend time. You want to just do the most interesting things, because otherwise you can be spread really thin. So that time was like, okay, if there's going to be a cell phone in every pocket, what industries could be impacted? And then find entrepreneurs that are really, really smart, that are thinking about it in a very nonlinear way. If you're like thinking in a very academic way, or like, obvious way, then, there's like 100 people think the same way. And so that leads me to certain people. And, those are the companies I invest in. And then fast forward to today, this happens all the time, right? So like I saw a wave around mobile. Then I saw a wave around China becoming super big in our lifetimes. And that caused me there. And then, now there's like new thematics that you and I are investing in, like climate, robotics, healthcare. Healthcare is super interesting right now, because basically the FDA was forced to be open-minded about new regulations because of COVID, right? And telemedicine, and how data is exchanged. It's not practical for everybody to go to the doctor's office now, right? So like there's a lot of really behavioral seismic shifts that opens up new opportunities. And so that's how I kind of tree down the question on like what to do and what to invest in.
But and it's work, right? Like you've been an early investor in Uber, Square, Twitter, Xiaomi. So you found like, what's fascinating is like, it's completely the opposite investing style of me, right? Like you're like the hunter. We've talked about this. You're the hunter. You're like, okay, I have this idea that mobile is going to be big. So what applications could be possible from mobile if we really think outside the box? And that leads you to Evan Williams and Jack Dorsey. And then you use your superpower of becoming, useful to people and friends, and just saying, how can I help you, to build a relationship? And then eventually you could invest in Twitter, and Twitter is now Twitter, right? And then it repeats itself, where you're like saying, what else can happen? And then you've identified Uber as like, oh, that's empowered and enabled by the mobile phone. And then you find Garrett and Travis, and you end up investing in Uber. And then you think China's big, and so like Xiaomi, and that's, so on and so forth. And that to watch has been very incredible, because it's very thoughtful.
Yeah, it's really weird. I had a friend who introduced me to another friend at a brunch in San Francisco, and he just in like 10 seconds gave a summary of my career, and it sounds so chaotic and and it's stressful because he went there, he went there, he went there, he went there. And I was like, well, that's just like where I thought the winds were going to blow strongest. And it's very nonlinear, but I just followed my instincts. And actually, that's probably another thing that I think you touched on it earlier, which is that if you want nonlinear outcomes, you have to have kind of a nonlinear thinking on what decisions you make. And I certainly thought that it's not for everybody the way I did it, but it worked for me because I just thought that this is the way for me to get ahead of where the world was going, and that it was super exciting for me.
I hope you guys are enjoying the conversation so far. On this podcast, I always preach about practicing gratitude, and today I'm thankful for our sponsor, Cash App, in making the quest possible. Cash App is the best way to spend, save, and invest in stocks, as well as buy cryptocurrencies in a way that's easy to understand and accessible for everyone. From payments to banking to investing, you can do it all on one platform. It's available for download on the App Store and Google Play, so you better go get that $10 your friend owes you from 2 years ago. Now let's get back to the episode. I actually think it's like it doesn't sound that chaotic. I think it's very thoughtful. It's very strategic because, like, for me, I'm the polar opposite. I'm like the farmer. In a way, I like put out my YouTube and my podcast and my reputation or whatever, and then people come in and it's like if I think it's an interesting idea or whatever, it's kind of like okay, like I'll invest. And with my career, I'm kind of the same way. I've been like, whatever captures my imagination at that moment. I've kind of flipped from like, idea to idea, and some of them work and many of them don't, right? And so it's just funny. Like I'm only doing YouTube, right? Because it happened that Jen, on my team was like, you should do YouTube. And she, we had met and she convinced me. And it wasn't like I thought YouTube's the future, which I do think now, but it's like YouTube's the future. Being an influencer is like really powerful. It's something I like really enjoy doing or might enjoy doing. So I'm going to like strategically try this, right? It was like very like a serendipitous. And so it's always been fun to like see that, it's kind of can work both ways. It's like,
it's interesting because that. Like for me, what you do and you're so good at it would stress the shit out of me. Because like, I think you're always on and you're engaging with an incredible community. People are really cool and positive, but it's a lot of conversations. For me, I just like to observe, sit in a really kind of almost like a sniper way, or, just try to see where things are going. I don't want to make a lot of decisions. I want to make concentrated decisions. And when I have those decisions in my head, I have high convictions, I just go on it. And it's worked for me. Certainly your style works for you too. But that's just been my methodology just like how I've kind of thought through things.
Yeah, it's interesting. One takeaway for people, there's a lot of people who listen to this podcast to learn. And I think one takeaway is that like there's many different styles for different people. Robin is like very strategic. He's having conversations like at a very high level with people who are like experts and finding those experts to have, he's trying to educate someone with himself and something is you're finding experts at like, the best, like we're learning about crypto now, right? So you're like finding like all these crypto funds that have been successful and meeting them and talking to them. I'm kind of like always doing stuff and sitting at the center of this like huge network of people, right? Like, and I'm willing to talk to like whoever, just like random startup founders who are just starting off, two guys in a garage, whatever. And like, I have all these affiliates or scouts or like friends who like send me stuff or like different kind of like little projects or companies I'm working on. And then just this massive information flow that's coming into me. And my time is like very occupied with like this stuff, but I kind of like that, because it's something to do with like how I grew up or something, I like that, like being in that center of information flow or whatever. And so it's been cool. And I think the takeaway is that, it took, I don't know about you, but for me, it took a long time to like figure that out about myself and like where I like to sit in the ecosystem and like how I like to, be in the world. And I think that's something that people don't really talk about very much or think about as much. It's like kind of what you finding your own style.
Yeah. And so like, if we were to talk about the kind of the metaphor of the room, I think you like to create your room. You like to create your space and your area of your zone of creativity. I've said that like, I'm not the smartest guy in the room, but I know who is, and I get in the room. Right. So my way is trying to figure out where that is. And, it's to me really stimulating to learn from people and not be the smartest guy in the room. So that's what I try to do in terms of every zone in life.
So let's spend a little bit of time talking about being an entrepreneur versus investing, because I feel like both of us, in a way,
I think it was
everything it all worked out, right? Like, and I think that you kind of have to go through life the way it unfolds, because that's your karma or whatever. But for both of us, I think there was a little bit of like, we stayed as entrepreneurs a little past maybe when we should have, and we
100%.
maybe would have been better off pivoting to investing earlier in our careers. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
So yeah, this is a great topic, because I thought of, as you get older, you think about time and your cost of time. And just, I remember when I was in 8th grade, my teacher said, like, in this interesting math where, like, when you are a kid and you're like 10 years old, the fractions of your time feels really long. And then when you're older, they feel fractionally shorter and shorter and shorter because you have less time. And as you get older, you start to realize how you spend your time and how expensive it potentially could be if you didn't choose the right track. I think that there's a huge bias in, when you're in Silicon Valley and building companies, that, the thing you should do is to be a founder. And I got pulled into it. You got pulled into it. And I think we probably were one startup too many in our careers. In my case, I had started a company in China, sold it after 2 years to Zynga pre-IPO. Felt like, that I learned a lot. That was a lot of fun. I want to do it again. I should do it again. But at the same time, I actually was doing better as an investor than as an entrepreneur. And I really didn't take that seriously, because I was like, oh, that's just like the fun stuff. That's not a skill. Like, that's just like investing in my friends. I got to do the hard stuff. I got to go start a company. I got to build a unicorn. I got to do all these things that are kind of intrinsically considered harder and more valuable, prestigious achievements. So I did it again, assembled and recruited a great team and fundraised, but didn't have product market fit, and just grinded for years trying to force fit product market fit. And probably, and as part of that journey, trying to be responsible with my investors and my team, I didn't invest while I was CEO of my own startup. And that was a big opportunity cost. I think that the humble comment on that is that you should just do the best version of you. I actually have an anecdote that I didn't take away for my future, my later years, that I should have, which is that when I was in high school, I went to this really good high school in Hawaii called Punahou. Punahou, so probably the best prep school in Hawaii, and probably one of the top in the country. Obama went there. Steve Case from AOL went there. A few others, and of Pierre Odemar from eBay. And I just didn't feel smart in Punahou, because like every kid was super smart. Like a class of 400, like about like 50 to 100 went to the Ivy Leagues. So like I never thought I could ever be valedictorian of my class. And actually that was a really, really good life lesson early in my career, because then I knew that either I could adapt to that circumstance by being depressed, or I could say, I just got to be number one of myself. I got to be number one of my thing. And if I'm number one of my thing, then I'm on my way, and I have time on my side if I start now on achieving that journey. And that's what I decided really early on. I wanted to be in technology, because I wasn't going to be valedictorian. I didn't get the A pluses in biology or chemistry and AP classes. I was probably number 30. I don't know what it was, but like I wasn't top 5. And that was really great, because like when I went to college, a lot of my classmates were valedictorians of their high schools. They go, and then freshman year, everybody's valedictorian, look at each other, and they all slaughter each other, and 90% of got depressed because everybody except 1 or 2 people were number one. And I was just not trying for that, right? I was really focused on like trying to start my journey in tech. And so fast forward to this is like, how do I become number one of me? I should have been an investor sooner, because it's easy. It feels easy for me to connect with people. It feels easy for me to see trends. It feels easy for me to identify those opportunities. And I get great joy out of being early and being right on, things in the future. It's really cool what we get to do as our jobs, right? Like we basically see a team that is struggling and trying to do a hard new idea, it's rarely a really hot idea. It's a weird idea. And then, 10 years later, it's like enormous. And these, $100 billion companies, and like you knew them when they were like 5 people. And I get great joy out of, and I feel like it's a big privilege to kind of get a keys to like the kind of a glimpse into the future with some of these founders.
I feel like that's such an important insight, is to find your joy, like finding your joy, despite what the world tells you to do.
Yeah.
That sounds very idealistic in some ways. It's funny because most people would take that as like, oh, you work in finance, so go like be a founder, right? Whereas for us, finding our joy was like, oh, we were founders, but actually we want to be in finance and be investors, right?
Well, I didn't call it finance, but it's just like, I like the analogy of sports really works, right? So like, should I have been like Brad Stevens is the coach of the Celtics, is now he was a coach for a long time. He's this like scrawny guy, but he's an incredible coach. He was never going to be like as good as his players that he coaches. But he's just found he's very young. He's like, I think he's like 40. He's like super young. And like, but he just really early on figured out that he was going to be a very, very good coach. And if I had started my investing career full time, I would have done better. And, one of our common friends is this guy named Chris Sacca. He invested in Twitter with me. Chris fully focused on being an investor while he started with a modest fund and was one of the all-time best funds ever. By the IPO of Twitter, Chris Sacca had become the largest shareholder of Twitter by investing and just keep bringing capital into buying a bigger position in Twitter. Meanwhile, after I wrote my check to Jack and Twitter, I started another company, and big difference in terms of outcomes. And so like Chris was very, very self-aware that that's what he should have been doing at this time.
Yeah. It's so important to just find the thing that you love to do and then just do that. Okay. So let's talk about our fund. As people always ask, like a lot of people follow me on social media and on YouTube, and here they're like, what do you do as your job now? Or like, do you even have a job? Like, so, for the record, full-time with Robin at Goat Capital. That's our fund. It's a $50 million seed fund, invest in seed stage companies, Series A's. Like we're investing in early founders, people who are.
Why do we call it Goat, Justin?
We called it, yes, it's a great question. Well, Goat came from like, we wanted to name it after an animal, spirit animal of founders. And the goat is the perfect spirit animal for founders because goats climb to high heights. They climb to mountaintops. But they're willing to go through low valleys and eat shit to get there. So, that sounds like being a founder. So tell us a little bit about what do you think how do you explain the thesis behind our fund when people ask, like, what is, everyone's trying to figure out a fund, a differentiation. What's ours?
Yeah, I think that there's two thematics. We want to invest in the biggest ideas that affect humanity. We want to invest in the most ambitious founders that are gritty enough to persevere on the hardest problems. And also as part of, the fun of joining forces, we also want to build things sometimes and kind of join forces in terms of resources to actuate some ideas that we have on our own. It's actually a very complimentary thing to occasionally build while investing because it keeps us really modern. It allows us to like understand all the latest tool sets on starting companies, the latest constraints on recruiting, all these things. And it allows us to provide, share our learnings with the companies we invest in. So we do a little bit of everything in that way. And we just put it all in one platform with Go Capital to just keep things really simple. The thematics that we like climate a lot. Climate change is, obviously an existential thing. I think, Justin, you've brought this up on video that you invest in this. This is one area that I've been super passionate about. Albert Wenger from Union Square really kicked me in the ass a couple of years ago because, he's like, you've done well, but, you should do more and you should help founders in this area. And this is about 2 years ago. And since then, obviously, Union Square has built a climate fund. And now this is kind of becoming more and more of a thematic with multiple funds. Our first investment actually was a climate company called Living Carbon, which is an incredible team started by Maddie Hall that genetically modifies trees to grow faster. it's part of like that thinking process that we talked about earlier, Justin, where like part of the macro questions I bring up is like, so how does the world look like now? How could the world look different? And a year before we met Maddie, I had this question. It's like, well, if we have GMO food, why can't we have GMO trees? And it's not as controversial because you aren't eating these. This is not food. These trees could just be left there, or they could be harvested for lumber. But meanwhile, as they grow, they can sequester carbon. And then by having a kind of a macro thesis, so that this is an opportunity, and we have to find the right team. By the time when we saw it, we could make a very quick decision to make a quick investment.
So, I mean, that's a great example of, it's kind of like your willingness to get outside your comfort zone and try new things. Because like a lot of investors, we came from gaming, right? Like people are always like, oh, you guys invest in like gaming and consumer. And we actually don't really invest that much in gaming and consumer, right? But a lot of people, they came from SaaS, and so they just crank SaaS companies. We're always, both of us, I think, are always trying to like get outside our comfort zone and try new things, both in our lives, but in career-wise too. So it's very daunting, right? Like when you first were like, hey, we should invest in climate change companies, I'm like, the fuck do we know about climate change? Like we don't know anything. Like we don't know any science or anything, like how this stuff works. So tell us about the process of like how we could even start investing in climate change companies.
Yeah, the way I kind of break down the problem of getting up to speed is first, the way I process information. I was a good student. I went to good schools, but I wasn't academically inclined in the sense that like I was like a textbook perfect student. I learned by doing more than I learned by reading. And so like academically. So like what in the case of climate, first, I wanted to just talk to the smartest people that I knew that were heavily involved. And then talk to the smartest founders that I could, get a hold of, and then not make any investments, just learn and kind of get on a listening tour on asking a lot of questions and getting smarter. And so that every successive meeting, I became familiar with kind of what the white spaces of what hasn't been done. And then once you figure that out, you're primed to make smarter decisions. And I think that kind of patient way of thinking, it's better to be right and shoot your shot when you should fire than just made a whole bunch of investments and just like hope they will work, right? So I think I spent a full year just reading a lot, talking to a lot of people, asking a lot of dumb questions with full caveats of people. Like, I'm trying to get up to speed because I want to do good here. I want to contribute to the conversation, but I want to think about it the right way. So that's how I did it. And one of the key things I think about a lot is like every industry is just a bunch of human networks. And so if you're doing the smartphone industry, there's a handful of smartphone companies. If you're doing automotive, there's a handful of companies. Climate's kind of complicated because obviously climate kind of in theory could encompass every industry, because, it impacts tourism, it impacts travel, it impacts healthcare, it impacts a lot of things. But in the basics of it, a lot of it has to do with biology. And so like, where do you find those biological nodes and that into those networks?
Awesome. Okay. So one final question and then we'll wrap is like, what are the kinds of founders that you like to back? I'm actually curious. I mean, I was going to ask, maybe I'll follow up with the kind of founders that I like to back, because I feel like there might be some slight differences, but I want to, everyone to hear from you first.
Yeah, there's a certain patterning around the founders that I've seen that I felt really like, oh wow, I'm talking to somebody special. So I give it a story of Jack Dorsey. So I was considered like the mobile expert because I was working at Verizon Wireless, and I met Jack, and he wanted some advice on how to like get a short code for 4044, which is the original Twitter. It was SMS before there was even an app, and sitting with him at the St. Regis in San Francisco for an hour. In 1 hour, I clearly realized that he was the expert, right? Like he articulated an incredible vision of, based on all of his past experience of how he thought about dispatch software and how it could apply to where mobile was going. And if you see somebody that kind of gives you a window into the how the world would look like, and it's clear as day, that's when you kind of get the spidey sense that how do we take away the obstacles to let this guy's vision or this person's vision come to fruition. I also love broken resumes in Jack's case. I think he's had started 4 companies and they all didn't work out. And I think, I would argue that at that time it wasn't clear he was very backable. Obviously, he's quite backable. He's incredible. He's probably CEO of the decade with his 2 companies now. And, but what wasn't kind of signaled in that point of his career was all the things he picked up to position himself for absurd success 10, 15 years later. And, even in my own journey, I basically failed all my 20s because I kept struggling with startups and ideas that I wanted to invest in or build. And then in my 30s, everything kind of worked. All my investments kind of worked. And you have to put the entire narrative together, because like, if I had not figured out all the mistakes that I had figured out in my 20s, I would not have made smarter investments in my 30s. So it's a long-winded answer on this founder thing, but the answer is like, it depends. And it's like you're looking for this primal energy of someone who has a very unique point of view in the world. And they have this deterministic, almost fatalistic belief that they have to go build it. It's extremely trendy right now to be an entrepreneur. It sounds really cool. It sounds really cool to like, tweet and say like, I raised this round, but it's brutal as hell. And it's really hard. People forget now that Jack is, started, I guess, like 150 billion market cap worth of startups right now, that he had to struggle to stay on his role during the early days of Twitter, and it's a fight. It's not like this overnight thing. And so do you see someone who has the tenacity to hold on and build and just stay focused? And those are the special ones.
Love that. All right. That's a great place to stop. It's amazing to be a partner with you. I learn stuff every day. And
I learn stuff every day with you too.
So thank you. So I hope from the conversation you got to know Robin a little bit. He's one of my favorite people, and I know that he'll be making more appearances on my YouTube and on this podcast as well. And I want to give all of you a special shout out for making it to the end of the episode, and a very big thank you. Last week we ranked 17th on the Spotify tech podcast charts in the US, and that's all thanks to you guys. I'll see you all next week for our interview with the one and only Gary Vee, who is one of my favorite entrepreneurs / content creators out there.